Before we leave the subject of functions, there's one last thing that I want to show you. And this is not something that's absolutely necessary, but it's going to be a really good habit to have while you're designing functions. And that's to put in default argument values. We saw earlier how the number of arguments that were passed into a function needs to match the number of arguments that the function was defined with. But with default arguments, that's not entirely true because we can set some defaults so that if it doesn't get a value, it has something that it can assume. And this makes our function flexible and also error resistant. So that's going to be a good thing to keep in mind and a good habit to have. Let's go ahead and try one now. I'm going to go ahead and keep working in the same functions2 file that I was working with on the last movie. And I'm just going to put a BR tag, and I'll start a new PHP tag. There we go, PHP. And let's just skip down a little bit so you can see it. Let's define a simple function here. Let's say it's going to be a function called paint. And this is going to paint our room a certain color, let's say, in our fictional world. So we're going to have then a color, and that's going to be the argument that's passed in. And for now, we're going to have this just simply echo back whatever we've selected as a color. Let's say the color of the room is, and then we'll use our parentheses and put in color. So we know how to call that. We know how to make that work, right? We can simply say paint, and then we'll give it a color like blue. Let's go ahead and try that. Bring it up in our browser. The color of the room is blue. I'm going to put a period at the end just to make it a good, proper sentence. Now, what if we didn't pass in a value? We know what would happen. If we take blue out, we do a save, try it again, it'll come back and say, warning, missing one argument for paint. But we can set a default value for color so that if it doesn't get a color, we have something to fall back on. And we do that by simply putting in a normal equals assignment like that. I'm going to put it with no spaces, but you can put spaces if you want. Color equals, and I'm going to put in red. So now that's going to be the default color. If we haven't been giving anything else, use red. I'll save it. We'll come back and we'll try it. And now the color of the room is red. So even though we didn't ask for another argument, it went ahead and assumed red. And if we instead tell it blue and reload it, it goes ahead and uses blue. So you can see how this is going to make our functions a little more error resistant because it doesn't give us that big nasty error if we didn't pass something in. It goes ahead and says, okay, if you didn't tell me that one little bit of information, I can go ahead and make a reasonable assumption. And there are going to be a lot of times where that's going to be helpful and useful to you as you start to program. Now let's go ahead and try and make this function a little more flexible. Let's say that we're just not going to paint the room, but instead we're going to paint a variable that is room. Okay, so we're going to be able to specify which room we want. Now, we can do that by simply putting the variable for room here at the beginning equals, and let's say the default will be office. So paint the office red. So now we can pass in two values. We can say paint the bedroom blue, and we know that'll work. We'll get the color of the bedroom is blue. Or we could leave out blue, and it'll assume that we want red. It'll go ahead and take the first argument as being bedroom is red. But what if we say blue and we leave out the other one, the location, the room? It's going to say the color of the blue is red because it's going to still assume that the arguments are coming in the correct order. So we're going to have to make sure that we always pass it something in the right order. And the same thing is true if we don't set default values. So let's say the bedroom again. Now we have a required value and a not required value. That will work for us. But if we did it the other way around, and we had our not required value, it'll still work as long as we have this in here. But if we take only one value, it's going to take bedroom as being the room, and then it's going to say, wait, I have another required value here, and I didn't get anything. So you want to always make sure that your default values occur last in line. I'll show you that. Say warning missing argument. So just spend a few minutes, play with it, get used to it. But the overall rule of thumb is anything that's required needs to come first. And the order of these doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I shift these around. as long as I call them in the same order that I pass variables in, whether I have color first down here, and let's put blue here, that won't make any difference. It'll still end up using them after it's assigned them just fine. But the key thing to remember is that anything that's required needs to come first in the argument list, anything that's optional needs to come later, and you can't skip spaces in between. So you need to pass in something along the way. But now you know how you can define defaults for those arguments that you pass in so that you don't necessarily have to pass all the arguments. You could pass just the first 3 out of something that was looking for 5 arguments if you knew that the last 2 could be assumed to be something. The other reason I find that it's really helpful to have default arguments is that it very quickly gives you a sense of what kind of information you're expecting to be passed into your function. Clearly here I'm looking for a color. I know it's going to be a string. It's going to be something like red. And here I'm looking for something that's a room. It's going to be something like a string called office. And that gives me some context for knowing what those variables actually mean in my functions. So now that we've looked at default argument values, I think we've explored enough of functions that we're going to be able to get a lot out of them once we actually start coding and developing. And we're ready to move on to some troubleshooting and debugging techniques and then actually building our first full PHP pages. So I'll see you in the next chapter where we'll talk about troubleshooting.